Let me tell you a story about a family portrait that looked perfectly ordinary until someone finally noticed the baby's eyes. A sharp October morning in Chicago drew an unexpectedly large crowd to the Riverside estate sale. Among the browsers sifting through a lifetime of collected possessions, antique dealer Clara Mendoza moved with practiced speed. Her experienced eye separated genuine value from ordinary clutter as she worked her way through the sprawling Tudor-style mansion. The Harrington family had lived there for nearly 100 years before the last heir, elderly Evelyn Harrington, died without children. Now strangers rummaged through private belongings, each object labeled with a price that turned decades of memories into a few dollars. In the mansion's wood-paneled library, Clara noticed a cluster of framed photographs arranged on an old mahogany desk. Most were what you'd expect. Family portraits across the decades, graduation pictures, wedding shots, holiday gatherings. But one frame stopped her. It had an ornate silver border, dulled and tarnished by time. The photograph itself looked like it came from around 1920, judging by the clothing and the studio style. It showed a young couple posed in what appeared to be their living room. The man wore a three-piece suit with a pocket watch chain, his hair slicked back in the fashion of the day. The woman, in a drop-waist dress, typical of the era, sat neatly beside him with a soft smile. Between them, held in the woman's arms, was an infant, no more than 6 months old, dressed in a long white christening gown trimmed in delicate lace, the kind wealthy families commissioned for special occasions. At first glance, it was a portrait of comfort and success, prosperous parents and their cherished child in a well-appointed home. The lighting was clearly professional, suggesting a formal sitting rather than a casual snapshot. But the longer Clara looked, the more one detail unsettled her. The parents' faces were warm and composed, their smiles full of pride. The baby's eyes, though, carried something else entirely. Instead of the blank, innocent gaze typical of infants, there was a sharp intensity, an awareness that felt too old, and a hint of fear that didn't belong in a family portrait. Clara bought the photograph for $25, unable to shake the feeling that those eyes were trying to communicate something she wasn't meant to ignore. Back at her antique shop in Lincoln Park, she carefully removed the print from its frame to study it more closely. Years in the trade had taught her that the most important clues on old photographs were often on the reverse. Stamps, dates, names, scribbled notes, anything that anchored the image to real lives. The back gave her exactly that. An embossed mark read, Anton Kowalski Photography Studio, Chicago, Illinois, and below it in elegant handwriting, October 15, 1920. Under the date, in a different hand, were 3 names, Edward, Lillian, and baby, Samuel Harrington. Clara's pulse picked up. She recognized the studio name. Anton Kowalski had been one of Chicago's most sought-after portrait photographers in the 1920s, known for photographing the city's wealthy and influential. Collectors prized his work, but more than that, Kowalski was famous for meticulous records. If his files still existed, they could hold details about the sitting. Clara spent the next 2 hours searching digital archives and old records. What she found made the picture feel heavier in her hands. Edward Harrington had been a successful banker in 1920, moving among Chicago's financial elite. Lillian Harrington, née Hartford, came from old money, her family fortune tied to railroad investments in the late 1800s. Then Clara found the line that made her go still. In a Chicago Tribune obituary tucked in the newspaper archives, it stated that Samuel Harrington died in November 1920, just 1 month after the photograph was taken. The cause was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, though in 1920 the medical understanding of SIDS was minimal and often speculative. Clara looked back at the portrait, focusing on the baby's eyes. Knowing he would be dead within weeks made that wary expression feel less like a coincidence and more like a warning. Was it possible the camera had caught something the adults in the room didn't see or refused to see? Clara reached for her phone and called Dr. Naomi Lin, a photography historian at Northwestern University who specialized in early 20th century portraiture. "I have a 1920 Kowalski portrait that's odd," Clara said. "The baby's expression doesn't match the parents at all. It's like the child is reacting to something the adults aren't." "Bring it in tomorrow morning," Dr. Lin replied, her interest immediate. Kowalski had a reputation for noticing what other photographers missed. His portraits often show more than people intended. Dr. Naomi Lin's office at Northwestern University felt less like a workplace and more like a compact museum. Vintage cameras from multiple eras filled the shelves, and the walls displayed landmark examples of portrait photography, spanning nearly 2 centuries. When Clara Mendoza arrived the next morning, Dr. Lin already had her examination tools set out. She slipped on gloves and positioned the Harrington portrait beneath specialized lights. "Anton Kowalski," Dr. Lin said thoughtfully. "He's an important name in Chicago photography. Came from Poland in 1910 and quickly built a reputation for portraits that seemed to capture people's inner lives, not just their faces." She studied the print through magnification, moving slowly across the image. "The technical quality is outstanding, even for him," she said. "Look at the depth of field, the texture of the mother's dress, the fine detail in the christening gown. He captured lace like it was etched." Clara watched as Dr. Lin leaned closer to the infant's face. "What's unusual about the expression?" Clara asked. "Several things," Dr. Lin replied. "First, babies around 4 to 6 months usually don't produce expressions this specific. You get reflex smiles, crying, sleepiness, basic states. But here, the child is clearly concentrating on something." Dr. Lin adjusted the angle of the light and tapped lightly near the left side of the frame. "Look at the direction of his gaze. He isn't watching his mother. He isn't watching the photographer. He's looking toward something off to the left, outside the camera's view." "Could he have heard a noise?" Clara asked. "Possibly," Dr. Lin said, "but the face doesn't read as curiosity or surprise. If I had to describe it, this looks like fatigue, even fear." She shifted her attention from the baby to the shadows across the room in the photograph. "And there's another detail," she added. "Kowalski was known for using natural light carefully. But in this portrait, the shadows suggest more than one light source. See these patterns? There seems to be stronger illumination coming from the same direction the baby is staring at, left of the camera." "What kind of light?" Clara asked. "Hard to say with certainty," Dr. Lin answered. "It's not the soft window light he usually favored. It could be a reflector, a lamp, or light bouncing off something bright. But it's noticeable, almost intrusive." Dr. Lin leaned back, taking off her glasses. An action Clara quickly learned meant the conversation had turned serious. "In my experience," Dr. Lin said, "when an infant shows that kind of fixed attention, they're reacting to something immediate in their environment. The real question is, what was in that room that we can't see?" Clara hesitated, then spoke quietly. "The baby died a month later. The record says SIDS." Dr. Lin's expression tightened. "That matters. In 1920, SIDS was often a label used when doctors didn't know what else to call an infant death. Many cases that would trigger investigations today simply weren't examined then." She looked back down at the portrait, studying the child's face again. "Combined with that expression," Dr. Lin said, "I think you're right to be unsettled. We should learn more about this family, beyond what the photograph shows." Clara nodded. She could feel the story behind the image beginning to take shape, and it was darker than the polished smiles suggested. Over the next several days, Clara Mendoza practically lived in the research rooms of the Chicago History Museum. At first, the Harrington records looked ordinary. Exactly what you'd expect from a wealthy Chicago family in the early 1920s. Charity luncheons, business announcements, small society page mentions, and carefully phrased notes about travels and gatherings. But the deeper Clara went, the less ordinary the story felt. Edward Harrington, she learned, wasn't simply a respectable banker. In 1919 and 1920, his name surfaced around several questionable financial ventures, deals later examined for potential fraud. He was never formally charged, but the reporting suggested the schemes had wiped out the savings of multiple families. His reputation, at least publicly, remained intact. Privately, the trail looked uglier. The personal records were worse. Lillian Harrington had been hospitalized twice in 1920 for what doctors then called nervous exhaustion, a polite catch-all that, in modern terms, sounded far more like severe depression and anxiety. Clara found brief references to rest cures and recommended isolation, the kind of language society used when it wanted suffering to stay invisible. Then she found a small item in the Chicago Tribune Society section, dated November 1920, and it made her stomach drop. Following the tragic loss of their infant son, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Harrington announced their intention to travel abroad indefinitely. Mrs. Harrington's physician has recommended a change of climate for her health. It read like routine social news. But Clara could hear panic behind the phrasing, an exit dressed up as a vacation. Property records from Cook County added another piece. The Harringtons sold their North Lake Shore Drive home in December 1920, quickly, quietly, and at a price notably below the assessed value. The timing stood out. Only 2 months after the portrait session, and roughly a month after baby Samuel's death. Clara kept digging. In the genealogy section of the Chicago Public Library, she uncovered the detail that turned tragedy into pattern. Samuel was not the first Harrington child to die. Lillian had given birth to a daughter, Alice, in 1918. The death certificate listed the baby's age as 8 months, cause, again, what was effectively labeled SIDS. 2 infants in the same family, both dead before their first birthdays, both attributed to a poorly understood natural cause. Clara stared at the paperwork, then at the portrait in her bag, remembering that wary, exhausted look in the baby's eyes. It was hard to avoid the thought that the child in the photograph wasn't merely uncomfortable. He looked as if he recognized danger. One more fact emerged from her searches. The Harringtons' Lakeshore Drive home still existed. It hadn't been demolished. It had been converted into luxury condos in the 1980s, but much of the original structure had remained. The current owner of what had once been the Harrington unit was Dr. Rachel Moore, a pediatrician who, according to a brief local profile, had bought the place partly for its historic character. Clara called her, explained the photograph, the deaths, and what the records suggested. "I'd like to see the room where the portrait was taken," Clara said. "Sometimes the space itself offers clues, details that don't show up on paper." "You can come by," Dr. Moore replied after a short pause. "But I should tell you something up front. There are a few unusual things about that apartment. Given what you're looking into, you may find them relevant." Dr. Rachel Moore's condominium occupied the entire 3rd floor of an elegant limestone building on North Lake Shore Drive. Walking through it, Clara could easily imagine the place as it must have been in 1920. High ceilings, broad windows facing Lake Michigan, rooms designed to signal wealth and permanence. "The living room where your portrait was most likely taken is this way," Dr. Moore said, leading Clara into a spacious room with restored crown molding and original hardwood floors. Modern furniture softened the space, but the bones of the old apartment remained unmistakable. Clara took out the photograph and compared it to the room. Even with the renovations, she could match the layout, the window placement, the proportions, the architectural details. The angles aligned in a way that made the past feel uncomfortably close. When I bought this place 15 years ago, I read everything I could about the building, Dr. Moore said. The Harrington story was part of what drew me in, and as a pediatrician I couldn't ignore the pattern. Mystery, Clara repeated, prompting her. Dr. Moore's face tightened. I've dealt with far too many cases of infant mortality to treat it lightly. SIDS happens, yes, but 2 infant deaths in the same household within a couple of years is rare enough that modern medicine would look hard for other explanations. She crossed to a bookshelf and pulled down a folder. After I moved in, I found items the previous owners had left behind, stored in the basement for decades. Papers, photographs, a few personal effects. I kept them because they were part of the unit's history. Clara's heart sped up as Dr. Moore opened the folder. The contents were clearly from the early 20th century. Household bills, old correspondence, and, most striking, an envelope containing a letter written on delicate stationery. Dr. Moore slid it across the table. This one is dated November 20th, 1920, 5 days after baby Samuel died. May I? Clara asked. Dr. Moore nodded. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if the writer's hands couldn't stop trembling. Clara read, Dearest Margaret, I cannot bear to stay in this house another day. Samuel is gone, just like Alice. And I know in my heart that Edward... I cannot write the words, but you know what I suspect. The doctor says it was the same condition that took Alice. But I have seen the way Edward looks at the children when he thinks no one is watching. There is something cold in his eyes, something that frightens me. I found a bottle of laudanum hidden in his study, far more than any person would need for occasional pain. And, the night Samuel died, Edward was alone with him for more than an hour before calling for help. When I touched my baby's skin, it was so cold, Margaret. So very cold. Clara lowered the letter slowly, her fingers numb around the page. She looked up. Dr. Moore's expression didn't soften. There's more, she said. I think you should see what used to be the nursery. They walked down a hallway to a room now used as Dr. Moore's home office. This was the nursery in 1920, Dr. Moore said. During renovations, I found something behind the original wallpaper, something the previous owners never removed. She pointed to a section of preserved wallpaper mounted behind glass. It was a delicate floral pattern, typical of the period. At first glance, it looked intact. Then Clara saw what Dr. Moore meant. Small, dark smudges interrupting the design, marks that didn't belong. Look at the height, Dr. Moore said quietly. Right where a crib would have stood. Clara leaned in. The marks were tiny, like fingertip impressions pressed into the paper. Fingerprints? Clara murmured. Dr. Moore nodded. Tiny ones, and not only those. She guided Clara to a second preserved section. The stains there were larger and more irregular. Less like prints, more like blotches absorbed into the paper. I had them tested, Dr. Moore said. Out of professional curiosity at first. They came back consistent with laudanum residue. Clara's throat went dry. You think Edward Harrington was drugging his children? I think he was poisoning them, Dr. Moore replied evenly. And Lillian suspected it, but she couldn't prove it. Not in 1920, not against a man with money and status. Laudanum was easy to obtain then, and poisoning symptoms in infants could easily be misread as a natural decline, especially with the medical limits of the time. Dr. Moore went to her desk and retrieved another document, folded and worn as if it had been hidden and handled in secret. I also found this, she said, a partial diary entry. It was tucked behind a loose floorboard. The handwriting matched the letter, but it looked more frantic, as if the writer had been racing against time. October 10th, 1920. Samuel has been so listless lately, sleeping far more than any healthy baby should. When I mentioned it to Edward, he became angry and said I was being overprotective, just as I was with Alice. but I watch him when he believes I am not looking. I have seen him give Samuel what he calls medicine, and afterward the baby grows heavy and drowsy. I found the small brown bottle in Edward's study again, the same sort that was there when Alice was ill. He claims it is for back pain, yet I never see him take any. There are marks on the bottle, tiny scratches, like someone has been measuring doses. Tonight I will watch more carefully. I will protect Samuel, even if it means... The sentence ended mid-thought, the ink trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. Clara stared at the broken line, then at the portrait she'd brought. The baby's exhausted, wary gaze felt suddenly clear. "He was looking at his father during the sitting," Clara said, more statement than question. "That would be my conclusion," Dr. Moore agreed. "Infants are far more sensitive than people assume. If Edward was repeatedly drugging him, the child would associate his father's presence with feeling ill, with danger. That expression in your photograph isn't random. It's instinct." Clara carefully put the documents back into the folder, as if touching them too much might erase the truth they carried. She had come to see a room. Instead, she'd found the outline of something far worse. Evidence that the portrait had been silently recording all along.